David Friedman is one of the world's leading pro-liberty economic and legal theorists. His book, The Machinery of Freedom, is celebrating its 50-year anniversary here in 2023. You'll find that as the years have passed, he's remained an innovative, at times provocative thinker. We recently got a special opportunity to pick his brain on everything from his love of poetry to his greatest influences to the American educational system and climate change. Professor Friedman, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is David Friedman. I'm an emeritus professor at Santa Clara University. I am the author of a bunch of books, and I have a web page at daviddfriedman.com, which has links to most of my published articles and full text of at least some of my books, probably most of my books, and lots of other fun stuff, including about 300 medieval recipes, one of my hobbies being cooking from very old cookbooks.
So, in introducing you, we'll have teased something that a lot of people probably wouldn't have guessed about you, your love of poetry. Where did that come from?
When I was about 10, we spent a year in Cambridge, England, where my father was visiting, and the house we rented had a complete Kipling and a complete Tennyson, and I learned poems that I still remember then, and since then I'm very much a fan of Kipling, but also of quite a lot of other poets. I write poetry, so that's, I guess, one of the things which doesn't come out. Well, it may come out, actually, if you read Machinery of Freedom, every section starts with a poem by me.
And how did poetry affect your thinking on liberty?
There are poems that tell you interesting stories about people, and you can learn things from them. There's a Kipling poem about one of the Mughal emperors, for example, which is quite interesting, Akbar's Bridge. Which is, maybe it's about how to be a good emperor, I'm not sure. It's one where the emperor's response to being treated very badly by a old woman who doesn't know who he is not to try to punish her, but to try to fix what she's been complaining about, which is the fact that they are spending a whole lot of tax money on building a mosque when they ought to be spending it on building a bridge so she doesn't have to take a boat across the river every time she wants to go. That would be, but mostly I guess I don't read poetry in order to think, but in order, because I enjoy it. Why do people watch movies and read books? And it's not mainly for their educational, that's sort of a secondary effect. It's mainly because they get pleasure out of it.
This video is brought to you by Students for Liberty, an international nonprofit organization focused on building a global network of elite young leaders passionate about liberty. Students for Liberty's coordinator program, designed for university students and recent graduates, is engineered to help you unleash your potential by providing you with the tools, trainings, and resources that you need to build a freer future. To apply or to learn more, see the link in the video description or visit studentsforliberty.org. So, other than poetry, well, your father Milton won the Nobel Prize, was an advisor to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and was called the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century, possibly all of it. Who or what else has been an influence on you and your writing?
That is the obvious one, of course, is my father. But beyond that, in terms of thinking about economics, probably the two other major figures would be David Ricardo and Alfred Marshall. One of the things that I've taught at a number of different universities is history of economic thought. And I try to teach history of economic thought as an economics course, not a history course. That is, the idea is to actually understand the ideas. And Marshall pretty much put together modern economics so that if you're learning the parts of economics we actually know, you're basically learning Marshallian economics, and that was more than a century ago. Ricardo was, in my view, the first really able economic theorist a century earlier, and part of what's impressive about him is that he solved problems he didn't have the tools to solve. That he was faced with the problem of understanding the whole logic of an economy, what we would now call general equilibrium theory. And if you take a course in general equilibrium theory, you will be expected to certainly know calculus and probably a lot of other things. Ricardo knew arithmetic, but he had extraordinarily good mathematical intuition, and he figured out ways of making simplifying assumptions, calculating how badly the simplifying assumptions would distort his conclusions, concluding that it wasn't by very much, and then using the simplifying assumptions to make the problem he was solving easy enough so it was possible to solve. There's a wonderful comment by Marshall on Ricardo somewhere, where Marshall is discussing the problem with drawing your economic conclusions from examples. And he says the problem is that you may not realize that in your example you've made some assumptions that don't apply to the general problem. And he then says it's very dangerous unless, like Ricardo, your intuition is so good that you can step from one example to another without ever drawing a wrong conclusion. And he then points out some case where John Stuart Mill did not succeed in doing that and did draw a wrong conclusion. So I guess those are probably the two economists that most affected me. But the one other economist who taught me a very useful lesson was George Stigler. My first economics article was a theory of the size and shape of nations. It was an article in which I tried to explain the history of Europe from the fall of the Roman Empire to the present, with an economic model of countries competing for territory, and with an explanation of why the same territory would be worth more to one country than another, and that would eventually give you a sort of an equilibrium structure of nation states, in which from the standpoint of the governments, the people were a tax revenue source, that the population were, as it were, cattle, not real people. And I wrote the article. I thought it was a very clever article, and I submitted it to the Journal of Political Economy, which George Stigler was the editor of, and he rejected it. And he rejected it on the grounds that in order to be published in his journal, an article had to contain evidence as well as theory. And he had some ideas that I thought were unworkable for how I could test my theory. But I came up with some tests of my theory, and I did them, and I revised the article, and I resubmitted it, and it was published. And I have felt grateful to George ever since, because in order to test the theory, I had to actually think much more clearly about what I was saying. That as long as it was just words, I could sort of speak imprecisely. But if I had to say, what actual testable implications does this have, I had to think through the theory much more clearly. And I thought that was what I really learned. The fact that the tests supported the theory was very nice, but it wasn't very strong evidence. The world is a very complicated place. But the fact that I had to think clearly in order to know how to test the theory was, it seems to me, a very valuable lesson. So now I should say the other funny part of that story is that at the point when George Stigler rejected the article, he was somebody I'd known since I was a small child. He was one of my father's best friends. But that was irrelevant. Yeah.
And how do you think that very first economics article stands up now? Could any of it help explain, say, Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, the late part of the argument is governments want to tax people, and they are restricted by competition among governments. So once incomes got high enough so that the government could support itself on income tax rather than on land tax, essentially, then the restriction on what a government could collect was the danger that its population would move to some other government that offered better terms. And there are three solutions to that problem. One of them is to have very big nations, so there's a long distance to the border. Doesn't work nowadays, but it worked in the 18th or maybe 19th century. But that's very expensive because it's hard to run a big nation. One solution is to build a wall around your nation, and the Soviet Union tried that, and that's a very expensive solution. It didn't hold up. The elegant solution is to draw your boundaries along areas of cultural and linguistic homogeneity, such that no Frenchman really wants to live in Germany, or even Italy. A few Frenchmen want to live in Italy, but Frenchmen want to live in France. Germans want to live in Germany. So therefore, once the thing that governments could steal, as it were, became income, there was an incentive to define your boundaries on linguistic lines, which in fact happens roughly at the relevant time. So that's, I guess, a little relevant to the Ukrainian thing, because the Russians insist that Ukrainian is really Russian and the Ukrainians insist it isn't, and whether you end up with Ukraine as part of Russia. But in this particular case, I mean, the short run stuff depends on so many other things that it was really a theory of the centuries, not of the years or even the decades. But I should say, if people are curious, I did give my webpage at the beginning, and you can find a link to that, whatever it is, 50-year-old article, something like that, if you're curious, and see.
Sounds to me like it's still applicable and makes sense. What about something you've changed your mind on since you started thinking really deeply about liberty, morality, governments, and markets?
The one thing I can think of important that I've changed my mind about was when I was in college. I was probably about 18 or maybe 19. And that was the nature of moral statements. That my belief going into college was that moral statements were really statements of taste. Sort of like saying, I like chocolate ice cream, I don't like people being robbed. And I got into an argument with Isaiah Berlin, who was a fairly famous philosopher who happened to be visiting at Harvard at that time. And he persuaded me that that was not the right view of moral beliefs, that moral beliefs really were beliefs about facts that people disagreed about. I spend a chapter in the third edition of my book, The Machinery of Freedom, which some of you may have read, in discussing that. I think it's a complicated enough issue that I don't really want to try to do it in this context. And I think I titled that chapter, as I remember, An Argument I Lost. And that's the only time I can think of where I really lost an argument on something, on an important conceptual issue, as it were. At least there may be some others that I'm repressing, but that certainly did change my mind, and I concluded that the belief that you shouldn't torture small children was not merely a taste like liking ice cream, it was really a statement of what you should or shouldn't do. But other than that, I can't think of anything very much. I've probably, I guess one smaller thing is the whole question of whether or not you have firms. That in the first edition of Machinery, I think I said some positive things about the idea of an agoric order, the idea of an economy where in effect you have only individuals interacting contractually, as opposed to what we usually have, which is you have firms where everybody is free, but some people have in fact agreed to take orders from other people, so that an ordinary employee has sold 8 hours a day of his time, in effect, to his employer in exchange for money. He can leave if he wants, but as long as he's an employee, he's part of a hierarchical system. And the general libertarian arguments about markets suggest that hierarchies are not as attractive as markets, and therefore I was sort of intrigued by the idea that you could have an economy in which everything was subcontracting, so to speak, in which it was entirely if you want to make a car, you hire this person to do that and this person to do that. And I've learned more since then, and it turned out that there was a system a little bit like that, the so-called inside contracting system in the 19th century, and it had problems. And it turns out that a very important economist, Ronald Coase, wrote an article, The Theory of the Firm, which explained why markets were not always superior to firms, why markets are not always superior to hierarchies. Now, I'm still in favor of voluntary hierarchies. The example that somebody else coming off of his ideas gave was, suppose you are making rifles, and this is 19th century, and you have a bunch of companies in the same building, more or less, and one of them builds the stock for the rifle, and one of them builds the barrel, and one of them builds the chamber, and so forth. And then one of them buys from the other three, assembles the rifle, and markets it. And that's all very well until something goes wrong with one of those three firms, and suddenly the other two are frozen, because they need their input in order to do what they're doing. and therefore there are some advantages to having them all under one roof, as it were, as a single firm. So I guess that's something where I changed my views a little bit, in the sense, not that I was ever in favor of abolishing firms, but I thought it would be sort of a nice economy if you could somehow, if markets could completely outcompete firms. But I think Coase pointed out correctly that there are costs to market interactions as well as costs to hierarchical interactions. And his argument was that what determines the size of firms is that a firm grows until it reaches the point where the inefficiencies due to hierarchy just balance the inefficiencies due to bargaining and having to depend on other people and such, and it then, beyond that, it uses the market instead. So I guess that's something interesting which my views have changed on a little bit.
You said earlier that you try to teach your course on the history of economic thought as an economics course, not a history course. And that made me wonder, what are your thoughts on American education in general?
I think the standard model of education in, I think, not only the American, but many systems, is not what at least appeals to me as the right way of doing it, because that model consists of sitting a whole bunch of kids down in a room and having a teacher talk to them. And I think one learns better by interacting with people, and one learns better by reading books and by figuring things out yourself. And I think that telling people that the way you find out things is to believe someone is not a good lesson. It's a rather dangerous lesson. That people have to learn to evaluate sources of information for themselves, and telling them there are only two sources of information, the teacher and the textbook, and you're supposed to believe them, is not the way to teach that lesson. The most positive development in the US at the K through 12 level is that the spread of various versions of voucher schemes has been greatly encouraged by COVID. That voucher schemes are schemes in which the money that would normally go to a public school can instead go to a student's parents to pay for a private school of some sort. And I think that's a substantial improvement, because that means that we can end up with a competitive market for schooling. Now, they may still do it wrong, and of course, there's no guarantee that my opinion of how people ought to be educated is right. My preferred form of education is what's called unschooling, which is what we did with our kids, and I like to describe that as throwing books at them and seeing which ones stick. So that, as far as I can tell, of the things in normal K through 12 education, only a very few of them are things that everybody needs to know. Everybody has to learn to read. Has to is too strong, but it's a big disadvantage not to. And it's probably nice to be able to do simple arithmetic. But beyond that, it's more a almost random subset of from all of the interesting and important things people might learn. And kids are much better at learning things when they want to learn them. So I would be inclined to the pattern in which you say, all right, we will encourage our kids in learning things. When they express an interest in something, we will point them at books and maybe online sources and other things, but we won't try to control their time and say, this is what you learned this week. So that's my own preference. That's what we did, and I'm moderately happy with the results. May or may not work for everybody. In terms of the universities, it's a real puzzle, because it's clear that graduating from college results in your having a higher income, and it's not clear why. Because the large parts of what people study in college are irrelevant to what they're going to do for a living. There's evidence that quite a lot of kids really don't know much more when they graduate from college than when they went in, and yet it still serves some function. And it would be nice if we could serve that function in other ways. Because part of the function, though, surely, well, I guess colleges currently are serving, aside from educating to the extent that they do, which they certainly do for some people, they're serving two other functions. One of them is mate search, that you're putting a whole bunch of people of the ages when they're looking for partners together in a social interaction, people selected to be rather like each other because they got into the same college and so forth, and that's an important function that everybody ignores. And the other function, I think, is proving that somebody can indeed show up for class, do his homework, study the things he's told to study, and so forth, and thus giving some evidence of characteristics that you would like in your employees, that they don't decide to sleep late today when there's an important job to be done. Now, the other problem in the American colleges at the moment is that they tend to be very largely an ideological monoculture. How that happened, I'm not sure, and it varies in what college it is, to what degree it is. That my daughter's experience going to Oberlin was that essentially the view of most of the students was that if you didn't agree with conventional left-wing progressive views, you were either evil or stupid. And when she transferred to Chicago, I think her impression was the students still mostly believed in the same views, but they no longer assumed that those views were obviously true and that nobody reasonable could disagree with them. So it was an improvement from that standpoint. And I don't have a good sample of enough colleges to know, but I think it's true. There are certainly a lot of ways in which the whole academic system has gotten badly corrupted by politics over the last few decades. That I was just reading some things by a professional philosopher who had written a number of things arguing to some extent against conventional current orthodoxy with regard to transsexuals. And basically, it was very difficult to get published. He gets very hostile responses, which aren't really dealing with his argument, but are saying you're an evil person for thinking things like that, and so forth. And I think that's unfortunate. I feel as though I now know more what it feels like to believe in to live in a really religious country. If you think of living in a country where there are certain religious propositions, such that if you disagree with them, people will think very badly of you. That's the circumstance for sizable parts of American life, certainly for the academic world in the US at present. Only the religion is some sort of progressivism of some not very well-defined fashion. And that's unfortunate, and I don't know if that's going to continue or if it's going to, if you think about religious revivals in the past, they tend to reach a high point and then slide down again, and so maybe we will be saved in that way. But that, I don't know to what extent that's true of European or South American educational institutions, but it's true of America at present, unfortunately.
Finally, what advice do you have for today's college students?
Oh boy. You should probably be studying things you actually find interesting, but you should also be studying things that you have reason to believe you can make a living doing. So find the intersection of those two categories. As far as I can tell, studying things like English or history with the intent of being an academic is a bad idea for almost everybody. That the costs of getting to a position where you have any chance of getting employed by a university are very high, and then the chance isn't very high. On the other hand, studying something academic, which you can then use, computer science or engineering, and there are probably things that maybe management, or I suppose studying economics. I'm interested in economics because it's fun and exciting, but presumably it's also will make you more employable for some people. Studying statistics will do the same. So think about what are the things you find interesting and seeing if there are any of them where, as far as you can tell, there are actually jobs available. I think that's what would be my advice.
And last one, the floor is yours. Anything else you think people should know, either about you or about the world?
A lot of people don't remember that this is the second time around. That about 50 years ago, population growth had the same status in the public discussion that climate change does now. That population growth was what all of the informed expert opinions told us was going to be something between very bad and catastrophic. And in particular, population growth was going to mean that poor countries were not only going to get poorer, they'd start starving to death, or at least get close to starving to death. None of that happened. What actually happened was the exact opposite of the predictions, that at this point, developed countries are having a problem with population shrinking, and poor countries are a whole lot less poor than they were then, and a whole lot less hungry than they were then, and their populations have kept growing. So we've got one example, at least, of a orthodoxy which turned out to be wrong, and nobody seems to remember that, as far as climate change, as far as I can tell, if you really look at the arguments, it's clear that it's happening. It is very likely that humans are largely responsible for it. It is not at all clear that it's making us worse off, that it is having a bunch of effects in both directions, that increasing CO2 in the atmosphere increases the yield of crops. This has been well established for a long time, so that means it gets more food. Raising temperatures, at the moment, human use of land is limited by cold, not by heat. The equator is densely populated, the poles are empty. That means that as temperatures go up, the areas available for human use increase. And I've done, I had a Substack post in which I went through my very rough calculation that if you accept the IPCC estimates, by the end of this century, the additional amount of land warm enough for human use will be about the area of the United States. So it's not a trivial effect. There are negative effects too, of course. So I'm not saying that climate change is a good thing. What I'm saying is we don't know if it's a good thing. What we know is that it'll have some bad effects and some good effects, and we don't know how large they are. And that was the situation with population growth. I actually wrote a piece on population back then in which I concluded that I couldn't tell whether the net sign, whether the sign of the net effect was positive or negative. That it was too uncertain. And I think that's the case for climate as well, even though everybody will tell you that it's not.
Well, Professor Friedman, you articulated some things here in a way that I hadn't heard or thought of before, as you've done throughout your career. Keep it up, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Very good.